Prison guards of Reddit, what is the most extreme thing you ever saw happen in your prison? My dad was a prison guard in Tennessee. Every Thursday was pork chop day in Maximum. When you have nothing you lie for the little things. One day they ran out of pork chops and a dumb shit guard tells the back of the line they're all out of pork chops, the rest of you fuckers are getting Delona. Minor riot with a 6 hours lockdown. 2 broken bones and like 10 people had to be treated by the nurse. Not me, but my mom is a prison nurse. She once had a dude swallow a balloon filled with drugs, and it popped or leaked in his stomach and he overdosed. Between fights, suicides, attempted suicides etc. worst one that got me was I cut down a hanger. He went into fight mode swinging at us. We got him to the ground and handcuffed him and pinned him on the floor. He started to cry begging us to kill him as we tried to keep him from banging his head on the floor. That was my first hanging and stuck with me ever since. Edit. Since people are mentioning how depressing this thread is, I gotcha. I was working a pod and had someone throw a melted down shoe heel in a sofa can at me. Think hot melted rubber. It mainly got on my shirt so I was fine, but started fighting with the guy. I had him pinned on the ground, with 64 offenders around me. I had lost my cuffs in the fight, they had fell out away from me. Another offender I had known for a while assisted me, handing me my cuffs and holding the guy's legs down. I was able to drag that one offender out, due to the fact the offenders on the pod were throwing stuff at us. The offender who helped me got his time reduced and I wrote him a letter for the parole board and spoke on his behalf. He got out, works a good woodworking job, $24 an hour, and writes to the prison with updates on how he is doing. He has a girlfriend and a baby on the way. Happiest story I have of that place. I really hope whatever health coverage they give you has really good mental health benefits. That stuff will scare your mind. I did a bit in Florida about 4 years ago. While I was inside, they let my cell block come into the common area to watch the iHeartRadio Awards. Never would have watched it on my own. But it was nice to have the distraction. This was the summer that Ariana Grande had that One Less Problem song, and she performed it right before JLo came to the stage. Now, I'm in with mostly Puerto Rican inmates, so JLo being on was a big goddamn deal. Some dude just loses his shit during the Ariana Grande song. Some of the dudes said he was into little girls or something, and throws a very lightweight plastic chair at the TV. Didn't think it would do much damage, but it busted the LCD. Hell, broke loose. Dudes weren't gonna get a chance to see JLo's ass, and they wanted blood for it. I ran my gringo behind back to my cell, and a 60-man brawl ensued. All of this to say, in the midst of the insanity, one guy bit another guy's thumb off, and swallowed it. My gringo behind is a big mood. What were you in for, if you don't mind me asking? I was in jail a while back, jail not prison, and watched Roots and the remake when it came out a few years ago. I was one of 2 white guys in a 12-man unit and thought for sure my white ass was gonna die. With all the serious ones, I thought I would give a funny one too, and X200B. Worked in a youth correctional facility. The units were Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, etc. On Charlie Dorm there were 3 openly homosexual youth who were way over the top when it came to stereotypical gay behavior. Talked in lisps, used red Kool-Aid powder to make lipstick, tied their sweater arms together to make a purse, etc. And X200B. Well, one day they are walking down the hall together, see me in my office and said, "Hey teach, check this out." Then the 3 of them dropped and did the Charlie's Angels pose. I laughed my ass off. Honestly, there's no such thing as a bad time to do the Charlie's Angels pose. ID came, and I think right on top of the casket at a funeral would be pretty poor taste. Not a CO but no maintenance staff. One inmate had a court date so left for the day. Apparently during his day out he managed to acquire a loose screw, not big or anything. Apparently he found it on the floor of the transport van. Anyway, once back in his cell he decides to use the screw to drill a hole in the plexiglass window of his door. Mind you, the doors are a layer of plexiglass and then steel grating. Anyway, he drills 2 holes, one at the top and one at the bottom of about a 2 feet tall window. He does this between CO patrols who are supposed to do a walk around every 15 minutes. The inmate then proceeds to tear his bedding and ravel it into a string, which he feeds through the upper hole and back down through the lower hole using the friction of the bedding. He literally saws a giant hole in the plexiglass using nothing but his bedding. When questioned, he informed the guards that this took him roughly 11 hours to accomplish without a single CO noticing it. He didn't escape. Like I said, there is still the steel grating. He literally just did this as a fuck you to the guards, and he had the spare time. This reminds me of a shitty summer camp I went to where when we got bored we would find strings and yarns and literally saw plastic lawn chairs in half with them. I have a family member who worked as staff, not a guard, at a state prison in California. Their job required them to work inside the prison. This was in 2010. There was another staffer who worked there. We'll call her Samantha. Samantha was an attractive 30-year-old who was happily married and had 2 kids. She was generally well liked and nobody thought her behavior was strange or different. One day the prison started having a major issue with cell phones being smuggled in. Lots of cell phones. The prison launched a huge investigation complete with shakedown, squeezing troublemaker inmates, the whole 9 yards. In one of the sweeps they found a love note between one of the inmates and Samantha. For anybody who doesn't know, prison guards and staff are absolutely prohibited from any sex with inmates. It's a serious crime that is prosecuted on a frighteningly regular basis. Turns out Samantha was not only having a sexual relationship with the inmate who had the letter, but she was having sex with 6 other inmates. So, she was fucking and exchanging long love letters with a total of 7 inmates simultaneously. One of the inmates had convinced her to smuggle in cell phones through the dry cleaning inmate work program. They estimate she smuggled in at least 50 phones this way. One of the other inmates she was involved with had been having his drug dealing proceeds from the street deposited into her personal savings account on the outside, so they had money to run away together when the inmate got out. The inmate was serving a 17-year prison term. When this was discovered, there was major fallout for the staff and inmates at the prison. Security was tightened considerably, the dry cleaning work program was suspended, and Samantha was arrested and eventually sentenced to just over 3 years in prison. The craziest thing about the whole situation? Samantha's husband stayed with her. She got out of prison several years ago and they are a seemingly happy family once again. Her husband is an absolute moron. Wife is breaking the law like crazy, and is banging 6 damn inmates. Divorce her ass. A guy trying to smuggle in a carton of cigarettes under a fat roll. That is not a typo. A carton, not a pack. That was just the decoy carton. There were 2 cartons under another roll. You just know that this, a husky gentleman, has tried this fat roll technique in the past. Ever tried to haul all the grocery bags in one go? Fat roll. Need a safe and secure place to stash your passport? Fat roll. Need somewhere to hide your crippling emotional baggage? Fat roll. My husband is a guard. I'm not going to be able to tell this as well as he could, but you'll get the point. He was doing count one night and there was an inmate that was bleeding, so they went in to see what was happening. The inmate had bitten the inside of his wrist and forearm and pulled the skin off down to the muscle and tendons. He was also chewing on something, and when he was told to spit it out he did, and it was a chunk of his flesh. He then immediately ripped off another piece with his teeth and, according to my husband, slurped it up like spaghetti. They rushed him to medical and he ended up having to be in the psych building. Clearly, after he recovered. Edit. Spelling. Via my father. One prisoner was trying to kill his cellmate, but didn't have a weapon. So he took a pen, stuck it in the guy's ear and stomped on it. It came out of the victim's mouth. An inmate with mental issues and HIV sliced his stomach open with a razor. Line was from below sternum to just below belly button. Survived, but man, it was ugly. There's another comment with almost the same thing. Maybe you guys worked at the same place? I can't tell you how many times I have seen that. Pretty common thing they do. I used to be a corrections officer. I found an inmate beaten up and his neck snapped in the gym one night. Gave him CPR until medics arrived, but he was too far gone. My dad was in prison and the craziest day he experienced was sometime around the end of his first week in. He had been keeping his head down, but one of the other inmates told him to meet him outside by the corner of one of the building during their free time outside. He was hesitant because he didn't want to get into trouble right out of the gate. He looked toward the corner of the building and saw a small group of guys huddled, and he got even more concerned. Just as he was going to walk away, they noticed him and called him over. He accepted. These guys were passing around a cantaloupe and sharing it. Each guy had a spoon and they'd take a bite and pass it on. A bunch of guys huddled around a cantaloupe generally goes a different direction. My dad's first week, he ended up beating a dude with the chair he was sitting on. Former psychologist at a youth detention facility. Some kids put little ball things in their penises, with the belief that if they do the deed it will be more pleasurable for the girl. They get these things from the ball of a wine stopper. The spill-proof stuff. Picture a spherical thingy less than a penny. Apparently they had operated on each other. They melted their toothbrush to make a pseudo-surgical knife and made a small incision on their dicks to insert these round things. They then sewn the wound close with conventional needle and thread. We staff came to know when some kids are getting feverish all of a sudden. We have to line them all up in the courtyard and let them drop their pants so that our nurse could check them so that we could remove these bolitors, the term for these, as to prevent an epidemic. These kids are aged 15 to 18. And there are not any girls around to fool around. Conjugal visits are also not allowed. Like, come on kids. A guy I worked with years ago had a piece of a domino in his junk after he got out of the clinker. It was one of those things that he was talking about it and we had to see for ourselves. For reference, I had a ton of piercings at the time and the subject came up if I had my dick pierced. Then he brought up his domino. Thanks for bringing up a repressed memory. I was working in the X house. My prison had 3 areas. General population, STC for somewhat mentally unstable IMs, and the X house, shaped like an X, for seriously mentally ill guys that would throw poop, cut themselves, etc. I was on the seg wing. Even though most cells in the X house were like seg anyway, this area had another officer to watch it specifically. So I was called over to watch a guy who had been placed on continuous suicide watch. He was completely naked with nothing else in his cell. And I have to stand just outside the door and watch him. So he's trying to do everything to get a reaction out of me. But I'm Stoneface Phillips, documenting every 5 minutes what he's doing. He climbs up on the bed, takes his dick in one hand and starts stroking. He takes a finger from his other hand and wets it in his mouth. Then our wet finger goes behind him, right into his ass. And then he starts yelling my last name. We all have name tags. Awark30, Awark30, Awark30. Then after he's done doing that, he walks up to the door. These are steel doors with just a window for seeing into the cell. We're basically face to face with this window between us. Just below the window is a chuck hole, which is a tiny door for passing food trays through. Thankfully it was closed, because I look down at the chuck hole and see yellow liquid coming out from the sides of it. I took a few steps back and continued my watch. I wasn't gonna let him get a reaction out of me. I wouldn't even know how to react. Edit. Holy shit, last I checked I had 11 upvotes. Whip yours out and start beating. Maintain eye contact. Assert dominance. All I wanna know is, who decided to call it X house and missed out on the opportunity to call it X wing? I responded to a fight in the shower where an inmate pushed the other inmate over the bench in the middle of the showers, jumped on him and bit off his chin. I picked his chin up and packed it in ice. I was also a trip officer that day, so I ended up escorting him to the hospital. On the way to the hospital the ambulance hit a deer. I also hit the deer at 78 miles per hour. It had bounced from the ambulance strike and ruptured in midair, exploding all over the front of the van. The van was damaged, but still drove. When we got to the hospital, the doctor didn't sanitize the piece of chin or anything, just sewed it back on. It didn't take, and a few weeks later the guy got gangrene and his chin fell off. Then he almost died from infection. That was a hell of a day. Currently a company. I work in one of the reformed mental health facilities for my state. Basically we're a prison with a strong focus on mental health rehabilitation. We deal with some of the state's finest, worst cases. I've seen a man with a literal hole in his body from his chest to below his belly button. He put it there. It started after he ripped his intestines out and bit through them. He then proceeded to enlarge the hole slowly over time. Longest 4-point restraint inmate in the state's history. Also seen a guy shove a 4-foot headphone extension cord through his DK and into his bladder not once, not twice, but 5 times now. He's also gouged his eye out. I've got stories like these for days. An inmate at our institution put 8 baby carrots in his dick hole. I guess they clogged his bladder and he had to have surgery. I wish our state had that. I was in jail for 8 months and I met 2 guys that really should have been in a mental hospital. One guy was schizophrenic and thought that his dead brother had been implanted in his chest. He also believed that he had circuit boards implanted in his skull that received a signal from an orbiting satellite that told him when to breath, despite the fact that they didn't show up on X-rays. He was locked up for possessing burglary tools. The court had ordered him sent to a mental institution, but there were no available beds and so he just sat in jail waiting to be transferred. Another kid that was there had a serious split from reality. He was in for stealing a dot car that had been left running while the workers were doing road work. He talked constantly, just this incoherent nonsense every minute that he was awake. Stuff like, they say the world is coming. Do you think the Facebook people will arrest me for talking to a girl I like? Okay, we're going to drop the beat now, take a listen. Everyone needs to know what they are talking about, so grab a chair and listen up. The sensei has said it's time to practice, but I'm not going to get caught walking around town. Time to flip it over and bring it around. Just on and on every single minute non-stop. The guys who were in the cells adjacent to his went nuts because they couldn't read or sleep with his constant monologues that made no damn sense. He would frequently walk around the cafeteria talking on his badge like it was a phone. I talked to him a few times and he could bring himself back to reality, but it was real struggle. He refused to shower and refused to take his meds because he just didn't trust them. Most of the guys felt sorry for him and kept an eye out for him, but wouldn't get too close because you could smell his funk 10 feet away. That second guy sounds like he just uses the predictive text options in his brain because his keyboard is broken. I've met people like that. Sounds like a dude we have living in our town. When I was working at a fast food restaurant, he would come in frequently, and people did not like him. I think mostly because he was really weird and always carried around a Bible. But think of a youngish homeless man. And he looked like that, pretty much. I remember he came into my dad's comic shop once and was just rambling at him, saying shit like their feet are too big to hear God. That's the main line I remember, but he actually recorded that tirade. But then he tried to punch an officer and was gone for quite some time. When I saw him again, a few months later, it seemed like he had gotten some help. I think he was back on his meds. He was shaven up, and he could actually talk to you. Sort of. He seemed more there, for sure, if that makes any sense. My employees still wouldn't deal with him, though, so I was always the one that took care of him. No, a prison guard, but I work in a psych hospital. Worst thing I saw was a man fingering his stoma in his stomach so hard it was bleeding. He was repeating "fuck me" in the pussy as he fingered it. Couldn't get that shit out of my head for a few days. As I was trying to pull his hand out of his intestines, he was looking deep into my eyes and begging me to fuck it. That guy was a mess. The amount of stories I've read on Reddit about stomas being turned into fuckholes is too damn high. When I saw this strange experimental horror movie called Angel's Melancholia that has this stoma fingering scene, I thought to myself, well, that shit's just sick and unrealistic. Fuck this. Reddit taught me otherwise. What's the matter with all those people fingering their intestines? There are meth users who will regularly rent out their stomas for drug funds. I, female, teach, volunteer, in a minimum security male prison. Security level of an incarcerated person doesn't correlate directly with the crimes they're incarcerated for. It's more about their public safety risks, such as reoffending. What that means is my class of minimum security guys has all sorts of offenders in it, including rape, child abuse, murder. Our class is held a few times a week in a separate building than the main prison. Trailer portable. My most extreme story is one from springtime. It couldn't have been a more gorgeous day, and everyone was chatty about it. Suddenly, a bit of commotion in the back of the class. Hey, miss up. Hey teacher lady, I head to the back of the trailer to check things out. Everyone's gathered around a window. What? Is there some new CEO on the block or maybe a transfer inmate they're all ragging on? I swear these guys are just, I thought to myself, preparing for some juvenile nonsense. At that moment, I saw what they could see. A mama cat and her 3 kittens trotting across the yard and settling in under some daffodils for a nap. A collective rose up from the trailer, quickly covered up with abrupt subject changes, shit talking and class questions. Of course, I can't help but smile every time I think about it. Moral of the story, they're just people. Maybe they did some shitty things, like real shitty things. Or maybe they didn't and they're in there wrongly. Maybe they've been rehabilitated. Or maybe they haven't. Hell, maybe they never will be. But everyone likes kittens. Edit. Formatting. A word. Kittens are the answer. Bring kittens to every prison and it'll be okay. Edit. You'll need help. Working in the air, we had a prisoner come in unconscious and covered in blood. We got him cleaned up and counted at least 12 stab wounds to his head and face. They were shallow, but the force caused the wounds to look like gashes, so sticks or staples were out of the question. He had even more wounds on his arms from trying to cover his head during the attack. We couldn't save one of his ears and he was still unconscious when I clocked out. Update. According to an employee that still works at that hospital, the prisoner was transferred to a trauma center the following morning. He had multiple fractures and spinal damage. Apparently he was a snitch and got jumped by other prisoners. Please don't leave us hanging like that. Did he pull through? How is he now? Did he provoke the attacks? I don't know any details other than he pulled through. He was a big guy with tattoos and it was assumed he was attacked by multiple PPL. Don't know why, but they were definitely going for the kill. In VR we usually don't end up those details unless we get updated down the road, which is pretty rare, but with something like this you might get lucky and get some more info. I have many stories, and many about this particular prisoner, but one stands out to me the most. Doing a count one day, everyday stuff, and it involves looking through trap windows to make sure everyone is present and breathing. Get to this prisoner's cell. Let's call him Prisoner X. Now this prisoner has a long history of sexual abuse from his childhood. As a result he is an absolutely chronic masturbator. The amount of times I've had to have conversations with him while he is going to town on his ham bone are innumerable. Anyway, doing a count with a female officer, she looks through the trap and immediately recoils. Now all I can hear is a loud buzzing sound and the sounds of furious masturbation. I decide to check the trap against the warnings of my offsider. Should have listened. Turns out he was using the unit's hair clippers, but he had them wrapped in a glove, turned on and shoved squarely up his ass. All I could see was the cord plugged into the wall leading into his loudly buzzing anus and him giving his old fella the exercise of its life. Edit. Yes. Fuck. I understand I never ended up referring to him as X. I thought I would at start of the story, and then didn't. I am gonna leave it up there though, because I can actually take criticism as well as X can take a pair of clippers. I don't think I saw anyone mention the gun, as there will be people who just drop their pants and start viciously jacking their dick the moment they see a female company. Doesn't matter if they are fat, skinny, ugly, pretty, deformed, just has to be female of some sort and they will stare them down and go to town on themselves. Now the thing is, this is not rare. This is not one of those every once in a while things. So many do it, it's glorified within prison. The punishment for something like this is just going to confinement for 15-60 days, where you can gun COs behind the door. No extra sex charges or anything. It's normal. Super fucked up though. There's a book by Nathan McCall called Makes Me Wanna Holler. It's fantastic and I strongly recommend it. He spent 3 years in prison and one of the things he described was there was one inmate that had long hair and was a bit effeminate. The author got seriously freaked out as time passed and the effeminate inmate looked more and more like a woman to him. The prison gangs started competing over this guy and basically broke his mind, telling him he was really a woman, until he became the sex toy of one of the gangs. It's crazy how screwed up prison society is and how strong the pressure is for the human body to have sexual release wherever it can find it. I had a hearing impaired, homeless looking guy come into the convenience store I worked at and he was asking about the male enhancement pills and if there was one for a woman. It went from awkward to scary because they started getting aggressive when I said no to their question. I had given them paper and a pen to write with. I had to ask them to leave because they were shouting and making me really nervous. They didn't leave until I had picked up the phone and threatened to call the cops. My husband worked at another store in the same town and he told me that some of the homeless regulars told him that the guy got messed with by a bunch of other dudes. They convinced him that he was a woman and really messed him up. I could believe it because they kept shouting at me, "I'm a woman." I wasn't even arguing about it. My daughter-in-law is trans. so it's not like it's shocking to me or anything. I worked in medical, and when we're on lockdown, this would happen daily, with little to no punishment at all. I got somewhat used to it. The most disturbing part was the eye contact. They never wanted to break eye contact, and most of them weren't even sex offenders before they went in. That's because this is such a common occurrence that it doesn't even come close to the worst thing we've seen in prison. I was a female co in a male prison for 3 years. I can't tell even you how many times this happened to me. Gross. Am correctional officer, but still in training. Told this story by my instructor who was a CO for 15 years. He was working in segregation. Essentially solitary confinement, but not that extreme in the sense that the inmates here do get to converse with other inmates and do get to populate outside during rec time for only 2 hours each day. But anyways, one of the inmates also had mental health issues, and after 15 days serving in segregation, psychological issues can form. So it got past 3 weeks and this inmate, who was already did not have a sane mind, went absolutely crazy, took a razor blade and started to cut open his arm until he got to the vein and cut it out and threw it at the door window, smearing it in blood so the COs couldn't see inside the cell. Once that happens, they have to suit up in protective gear and enter the cell with a body-sized shield. After pulling him out and sending him to medical to get treatment, he is sent back to his cell after the stitches were sewn. 2 hours pass, and the inmate takes another razor blade and starts cutting open his stomach. These blades aren't the strongest. They are very flexible, so it takes time to actually force it straight enough to cut it removed from the shaving device. He began to cut and spent hours until he cut open his stomach and began to pull out his own intestines. It was a cycle of him going to medical and getting stapled up and going back to his cell to open his wounds back up until he was put in a turtle suit, straight jacket. These types of experiences aren't abnormal for mental health patients being put in segregation. Let's see. Back when I worked in the industry, one guy disemboweled himself essentially to get a demon out. He lived, not sure about demon. His intestines were out of his body and he was ghost white from blood loss too. Guy was putting nails or screws up his urethra. 3 chick hid a can lid in her special kangaroo pouch and pulled it out to try to cut herself after an adverse hearing result. There was this one man I was looking over in prison. He was on suicide watch. Went to the bathroom for 5 minutes, came back and he had pulled all the stitches from his chest, opened the chest wound and was trying to stab himself in the heart with it. Not me and not a prison guard, but one of my college professors used to teach at a prison. She was a Portuguese literature teacher for them. This happened in Brazil. She was teaching the inmates, all male, about poetry and it was close to Mother's Day, so she told them to write a poem about their own mothers. This was in a very impoverished area, and she told us all the inmates were illiterate before she started with them. One of the inmates wrote a beautiful poem about his deceased mother, that was killed right before he was arrested when he was much younger. He was arrested for killing his father, who murdered his mom. All the inmates started clapping and whistling, because it was so beautiful and heartbreaking. But then the guards went nuts thinking they were messing around and started beating the inmates so they would shut up. Classes were cancelled after that. My professor said it was all very shocking. It was a pure scene with people bonding and learning, and the guards resorted to violence without even thinking. She never went back to teach at a prison again. It was a pure scene with people bonding and learning, and the guards resorted to violence without even thinking. This made me sad. My dad was a pay officer in the prison service for a couple decades. He has a few stories. One that I always remember was about there was this one kid who was about 16 but he was about 6'4" and built like a tank. He also had a bit of a temper. One day when my dad is supervising the gym workout, he looks over towards the benches and this kid picks up a 34-kilogram dumbbell, lifts it above his head and starts to swing it down onto another inmate's head who is laying on one of the benches. My dad manages to sprint over, grab this kid and pin him against the wall, just in time to stop him from killing the other inmate. At this point my dad is thinking if this kid wants to fight, he is probably going to win. But luckily he had a good reputation, so the kid didn't fight, but also other inmates alerted other guards and X200B. If he was able to carry through with that swing, that inmate's head would literally have exploded. There is no other outcome to that. It was straight up attempted murder and X200B. Nothing ended up happening with the kid. The prison head didn't deem it to be much of an issue because no one was hurt, so my dad brought the 34-kilogram dumbbell into the meeting to show her. She didn't care, ignored it because it makes her prison look better on paper. I feel like I'm the type who would definitely have that dumbbell fall on my foot as I try to stop the kid. Props to your dad for saving a life. You hear all these stories about how there are some fucked up people in prison, and sooner or later you realize it isn't always just the inmates. Honestly, think about the kind of stomach you need to handle seeing that kind of brutality as a guard. No matter what, some bad dudes who like to see bad shit will filter into those jobs, and even thrive because nothing shakes them. Some guards are really good people who just want to do fire jobs, but also some are more animal than the inmates. Edit. Also, not all inmates are inherently animals either, just some. Not trying to blanket every person in prison as a monster here. Not mine but my dad's. First day he was there, a riot occurred because some dumbass prisoner thought it would be funny if he stole a book from a prisoner and blamed it on someone else. Long story short, the guy who was blamed had all 4 of his limbs broken and his face beaten to pulp. Apparently they already had beef between them. Edit. Details. This is taking the word extreme to a different level, but when I was a prison guard, female working in a men's max, I worked in the kitchen. I tried to be firm, fair and consistent, and it worked. I mean, I went home whole every night. Somehow a few of the prisoners found out it was my birthday, and towards the middle of my shift they had me come around the office, and there on the table was a 4-layer industrial size cake with pink frosting. I was touched. They told me to get my piece before everyone else did, and not even 10 minutes later it was gone. Edit. Holy moly. Gold exclamation point. Thanks for popping my gold cherry, mysterious stranger. AWW, that's badass. Nice to see something wholesome in this shit show of a thread, haha. My dad did 5 years in prison, and for my birthday some years he makes me prison cake for brownie mix and Oreos. It's great. Prison cake for brownie mix and Oreos. Need that recipe ASAP. 1 pack of duplex cookies, choc and vanilla mixed. I can of Sprite. Separate all the cookies from icing and place icing in bowl, cookies in bag. Take soda, crush said cookies to powder in bag. Crack said soda and mix with crushed cookies to batter consistency. Use tablespoon of soda in icing. Whip icing and sofa to create frosting. Pour cookie batter in bowl, cook in microwave for desired time. Times do vary. Sip remaining soda as cake cooks. Remove cake from bowl, spread icing on cake. Walla prison cake. For more creativity, do vanilla side cookie in one bag, choc in the other, so you have vanilla and chocolate batters, and make swirl cake or 2-tier flavored cake. Source. Spent 12 of my 43 years of life in prison. We've all read some terrible shit in this thread so far. Thank you for being a solid person, and also thank you for sharing something in this thread and a relief from all the crazy shit. One of my former teachers used to provide mental health services in the county jail. She said the worst thing she saw was an inmate who went insane. He was quiet and polite, and doing a small amount of time for a minor crime. But then, he got in one small fight and was moved to max, and something in him snapped. He decompensated so quickly that by day 4, he was smearing fesses on the wall and singing nursery rhymes. He was taken away by ambulance and was never seen again. Solitary confinement is cruel and unusual punishment. Many of its aspects are literally torture. Several weeks ago I spent over a week, 9 days, in solitary confinement, in a psychiatric facility. I thought I wouldn't mind the time to myself, but, damn, it didn't take long to snap. About 2 days. I just woke up from a nightmare about it about 2 hours ago. I was in solitary confinement for 10 days in 2015 and it really hurt my mind. Nothing but the New Testament to read and I couldn't see the clock on the unit. My buddy who ended up going for 60 days was never the same. He talks to himself out loud whenever he's in deep thought and can't really control it. WTF? Holy shit. This is some vicious shit. Whoever is responsible for locking you guys up should be thoroughly looked at. It's estimated that between 80,000 and 100,000 people in the United States are in solitary confinement right now. It's a system-wide problem not unique to these guys. What did it involve for the person? I'm asking out of curiosity. No need to respond if you don't feel like it. But is it basically just leaving you in an empty room? Yes, it's being alone in an empty room, but it's more than that. The lights are always on. There are no windows. There is no clock. The only way to tell roughly what time it is by what kind of food they are serving you. It's cold. You may or may not get a blanket. When you wake up from sleeping, you don't know if it's been 8 hours, or 8 minutes, and very soon you have no idea what day it is. You don't count the days you have in there, as you can't. It's impossible. You count your meals 3x a day. 5 days is 15 meals till you can get out, and that's assuming you know when you'll get out. Also you're in there because you did something wrong. And if you did something bad enough to put you in isolation, that means that time will probably added onto your sentence. Will it be another month, another year? Will you die in this box? Will they take away visitation rights so you can't see your family for a while? Who knows? Basically you're isolated from any sense of time and human contact. The only time you see another human is when they check on you to make sure you haven't killed yourself. The bland food doesn't help. Often the only thing you are given to read is religious text. Basically everything is as dull as it can be. You may be sound isolated too. Or maybe not. Which is worse, absolute quiet, or being next to other people who are angry and yelling and banging on walls and crying all the time? Every time you hear the guard door open, is that person coming to give you food, coming to let you out, coming to tell you that you'll be in there longer? Or will they simply ignore you, without anything entertaining or any type of mental stimulus? You're left with your thoughts, and in prison, it's often thoughts of guilt, anger, fear, and impending doom. When that happens, your brain does funny things to keep itself occupied. If you've been thrown in there and you feel you've been wronged, expect all that anger, frustration, unfairness to develop into physical violence. In short, they strip you of all sense of humanity, and when that happens all that's left is a beaten dog. Some dogs cower, some bite back, and some don't know what is going on, and this is from someone's perspective of a sound mind. You put someone who has a mental illness in that situation, and you will do damage to them you can never repair. I remember taking the tour, with the audio accompaniment, at Alcatraz, and there was a part where a guy talked about being sent to solitary. Apparently they kept it completely dark, so first thing he'd do upon entering the cell would be to rip a button off of his uniform and toss it into the darkness. Over and over he would search for the button and then toss it again, just to keep his mind occupied. Not a prison guard but a former paramedic in one. In this prison camp where I worked, inmates worked in a field on what was called a whole line. The inmates were given tools randomly and lined up to work randomly. One inmate marked a tool and every time he got that particular hoe he worked on sharpening the side of the blade. He then waited until he had that tool and was lined up next to a particular inmate. He then used his sharpened hoe to cut the man's Achilles tendon and almost sever his foot. It turns out this was in revenge for the victims repeatedly stepping on the back of the inmate's foot as they were moved around the facility. Further, he told the guards that he had been planning and preparing for the attack for over a year. Not a prison guard, but was told this story by a kitchen supervisor working in a minimum security prison. He was supervising on the morning shift when he went to use the inmate bathroom and the kitchen. Because the other supervisor was using the officer bathroom and he really had to go. The inmate bathrooms had doors, full metal ones, and stalls, unlike in the rest of the compound which just had open stalls, but without locks on them. The inmates who worked in the kitchen would jerk off in them and had porn magazines hidden under the sink, so he was always careful to knock beforehand, not wanting to walk in on someone mid-stroke. That day, he was in a bit of a rush and forgot to knock. He walks in to find an elderly inmate fucking himself in the ass with a banana off the lunch line, and sucking off another banana. The great thing about a banana, it could still be peeled then eaten after working up an appetite that way. What? Is there a more efficient way to get your daily dose of potassium? From my CO brother. Some guy bashed his head open and wouldn't cuff up to have the nurses help. He was being absolutely combative and going crazy. He covered himself in the cell he was in with blood, and drew a picture of Jesus with the blood. He told my brother he was going to die and to tell his family he loved him, before passing out and apparently actually almost dying. He said it messed him up for a good while. I was a supervisor at a adolescent male sex offender secure level 5 facility. Beforehand, I was a regular CO there for 3 years and never saw anything more than a few fights and a few masturbators. My first Friday evening on the job and we had the largest riot the facility has ever had. The first it ever had. 2 kids from the same unit attacked and pinned down a staff holding sharp pencil to his neck. They then whistled to the other units which triggered 2 other residents to do the same on their unit. We had 2 staff per unit, a floater, and a supervisor for 40 kids. I ended up having to call the police so come assist. They came in with guns blazing, and the kids dropped the attempt damn quick. I was a mailroom employee at the unit in Texas that houses death row. For security reasons, most of death row inmates had their mail constantly scanned or read, while other inmates just had them searched for contraband. This whole process was a knee-jerk process out in place after a governor was threatened from doctor, then bringing the mail to the inmates and telling them you read it and found some shit was terrifying because they obviously never liked and often threatened violence. The stuff you read is fucking insane. I read plenty of neo-Nazi plots to help bring in the New World Order, stuff that was completely encoded in their own little systems, and all sorts of absolutely depressing shit. The worst one I ever read had to have been the one of an inmate who was scheduled for execution the next day, and was sending a bunch of fuck you letters to the victim's family, as if they hadn't been through enough. I know this will get drowned, but if anyone has any questions about it I'm happy to answer. Edit. The families would not receive those letters. They were sent to an ombudsman after being screened. and typically to law enforcement past that. The only way those families would receive it is if they filed a subpoena to get them, I imagine. Somewhat speculation, but I'm fairly certain that is the process. Sorry for any spelling errors in any replies, I'm on mobile. Were there any consequences for sending mail that encouraged violence or any of that other stuff? Anything like that was sent above me, and it would be up to the ombudsman and powers to prosecute. I never heard of anything happening besides some disciplinary stuff, but I wouldn't be the one to hear about anything going legal, so to speak. A family member and I used to work at the same prison, and the prisoners knew we were related. My family member got into a minor car accident and had a few weeks off work to recover. Word got out about it to all the prisoners, and I constantly got asked how I was coping because they all heard it was super serious. It wasn't. While one was asking me what happened when we had a lockdown code so everyone had to go back to their blocks. Came to find out in the incident report that a fight had started because two prisoners heard two different stories on what happened to my family member. Couldn't agree. Started a punch up and got the whole block of about 80 guys brawling. Whole place got locked down for like 10 hours, all because my family member can't drive. LMAO. I did a little time downstate for weed 10 years ago. It's crazy how in jail movies they always precede the fights and wars with something understandable like stealing or gang stuff. I literally saw brawls start over things like ramen noodle seasoning packs, and who was a better point guard, Isaiah Thomas or Magic Johnson. I was watching a prison documentary yesterday, and one of the main storylines was a fight over Monopoly rules. That shit can get vicious between family. Why would they give inmates Monopoly? What do you mean go to jail? Motherfucker, I am in jail. Charges at other player. Edit. Thanks for the gold. Anybody know what the exchange rate is in packs of ramen or Newports? We have a standing rule at our house. No Monopoly, Risk, or Diplomacy games, as they always end in an argument. Also no Twilight Imperium or Advanced Civilization, because they never end. We were watching a movie on the communal TV. Some guys wanted to watch a basketball game that was just starting. We can CO changed the channel. Everyone watching the movie got up. Guard changed it back. Basketball guys got upset, so the CO let us vote. Movie 1. Basketball guys got more upset. Said that the guys who wanted to watch basketball were still in their cells to vote for basketball because we're not watching basketball. CO states that if anyone says basketball again, he's turning the TV off. Basketball guy considers for a second, realizes that he's not watching basketball anyway, and starts yelling basketball. The best part was the fight that ensued. It was a work release unit that no one wanted to get kicked out of. So two guys had to pretend to hold back two guys who pretended to be held back. Since a fight would mean you don't get to leave for your job every day where you have a cell phone stashed and eat normal food. Although we didn't see that weekend CO ever again. LMAO. It was a work release unit that no one wanted to get kicked out of. So two guys had to pretend to hold back two guys who pretended to be held back. Since a fight would mean you don't get to leave for your job every day where you have a cell phone stashed and eat normal food. That shit is so true, and I wasn't even there. Worked at a work release unit for 3 years before changing units. This is as true gets. Lots of big talk from guys who have a really good thing going. We sent our guys out on furlough once a month for 48 hours as long as they met a few conditions. We rarely had any issues. Is it best to back down in order to avoid that particular beating, or stand your ground to prevent being picked on in the future? Mayo, this is a good story. What's the reaction of your relative when you tell the story? They'd heard about it before I got home, but they found it hilarious. The prisoners also got the correct story in the end, haha. That's so sweet and heartwarming. Definitely not what I was expecting, XD. I started this story thinking they were going to use your relationship to their advantage somehow, like threatening to hurt the other if you didn't do something. Turned out to be really wholesome. Not quite the same, but my aunt was a psychiatrist in a women's prison in the 70s. They had a change of warden from someone reasonably reasonable to someone who was extremely unreasonable. One of the things she instigated was a work program to help landscape a garden for the prison. Naturally, a number of the prisoners decided to sign up with the change to be outside. However, it wasn't until after they'd signed up that they found out that it was replacing their usual rec time, meaning they had no breaks and more work. The warden was insistent that she have a flower garden for the prisoners to enjoy, as it would be calming. It just so happened to be facing her window. So, diligently the later prisoners worked and planted flowers ready for the coming spring. So along comes spring. And during the time that the flowers had, well, flowered, the warden had been on a 2-week holiday. She came back to love you from her office window. Fuck off spelled in begonias, in 10 feet high font. I was a CEO about 18 years ago at a max pen for 14-24-year-olds. It was insane to me that such young kids could be locked up with adults. We had a lot of construction going on in the prison, and they would bring in older convicts to do the work. One day a young guy started talking shit to an older one, and the older guy hit him in the face with a coffee pot. Lots of cuts and lots of burns. Another time one of the construction guys snuck a welding rod back into the prison and used it to stab another inmate through his throat. I'll never forget that. I couldn't tell who the victim was because of the amount of blood. Surprisingly, he survived. I was personally involved in 2 extreme situations. One came my first night being alone after training. A group of 5 inmates jumped me. First one hit me in the back of my head and I went blind for a second. I couldn't get my bearings, but I knew I needed to get to the unit door so the guard upstairs could let me out and lock them in. I ran for the door covering my head and luckily got out. When I was trying to shut the door, which was a large steel door with bolts that shot out to lock it, when it got close to being closed, I shut one of the inmates' feet in it. It crushed his foot. IDK if they were able to save his foot. He was transferred from the hospital to another facility. Then one other time a guy didn't want to go back into his cell, so he tried to fight me. We were on a balcony about 12 feet up. Imagine a 2nd floor outdoor hotel. There was a line of cells on the 1st floor with stairs on each end that led up to a line of cells in the 2nd floor. Anyway, he was trying to push me over the railing. We wrestled for a bit, but when he tried to push me off, I started hitting him. In the scuffle, he ended up trying to run and jumped over the railing. I think he wanted to kill himself, but he landed on both feet, which broke both of his ankles. Prison is real lame for all involved. Guy breaks both ankles. Prison is real lame for all involved. I see what you did there, OP. I used to work in a minimum security prison. One inmate decided that the medical staff weren't treating his diarrhea properly or quickly enough, so his solution was to shove an apple up his ass. Surprisingly, this didn't work out the way he thought. Not a guard but a prison nurse had to respond to a cell fight where one man bit off another man's nose. The most extreme one I heard though was from a doctor I worked with. My first patient ate her own eyeball. Edit. Y'all. I'm a sick fuck who's enjoying reading this thread. Can anyone hook me up with a subreddit where I can share and read more fucked up prison stories? Jesus. Both definitely suggest some type of mental disorder. For the guy who got his nose bitten off, did he get some kind of replacement? Or does he just have a hole in his face now? He died. If he'd survived, he would have been eligible for plastic surgery, though. No mental issues with those guys. Just fights get really violent, desperate. The woman who ate her own eyeball did have a psychiatric disorder. Damn. Well, you're far tougher than me to work in that kind of environment. Definitely tough people. I had a good friend that was a CO for years. It didn't go well for him. He's now locked up himself. He had some issues before he took the job, but I really think seeing so much bad stuff had an impact on his mental health. My first patient ate her own eyeball, and X200B. As a former CO, we always had those types that were even too dangerous for secure psychiatric hospitals. People for whom care was just too difficult. I hated those inmates as you never knew what you'd stumble upon. Every now and again we'd hear that someone was getting transferred from a secure psych facility and you just go, oh, number. Serious question. Assuming you were a CO of a normal prison, how is it better for someone in that condition to be in a normal prison rather than a specialized secure psychiatric hospital? It wasn't better for the inmate, but that they were too dangerous to handle in secure psych lockups. We had a greater preponderance of tools at our disposal to use to protect ourselves and other inmates. Often with secure psych hospitals there is a critical shortage of beds and staff, so they have to balance resources, and some people are just too violent and too sick to get better, so what happened was that they were transferred to us and our medical staff worked with them. They'd see a psychiatrist, psychologist, specialized nurses and OTs, but they do it in the confines of a very controlled unit within the prison, and ultimately, if it came down to it, we had a lot more of an ability to project force, including lethal force, if necessary. The use of force is probably the biggest thing. I'm a prison psychiatrist and trained at a large hospital. The size and strength of the COs and their willingness to participate in care is a huge help when dealing with large violent psychotic males. Oftentimes the psych nurses at a hospital are female and there are only 1 or 2 male staff on duty at any given time. It's much more difficult to control such a patient with that type of staffing. Now, a few years later, I work as an attorney and adjunct professor, and when I tell people the story of how I lost 3 teeth, a psych patient kicked me while they attempted to deliver Haldol, people are both shocked and horrified. Not me, my past co-worker's husband. He has PTSD from this and other events, and as a warning, let's just say NSFL. He worked at a local woman's prison. One time he was called to a cell because he was told that there was a woman who miscarried. She fully gave birth to a live child, and then attempted to shove it down the toilet. The baby died, and he walked into seeing all of that. My dad worked at the Chino prison for years and told me a story. He was going around doing checks, and as he was leaving a hall, a prisoner called out to him, "Hey Smith," not his real name. And my dad asked him what. The inmate told him, "Come here." My dad, not wanting to deal with this, just says, "What? Just tell me." The inmate says, "Smith, I really need you to come here right now." My dad, a bit annoyed, goes over to him and says, "What?" The inmate then whispers to him, "You left your keys in that door. Go get them now." My dad looks, and sure enough, he had left his keys in that door. He grabbed them and then gave the inmate a big thank you and slipped him a few packs of smokes. My dad says that inmates were typically good to him because he always treated them fair and with respect, but always made sure they knew he was the one in charge. Not a guard, but a former incarcerated person. Saw a guy get stabbed about a dozen times in the kidney. Aluminum bat beat down during a softball game over a call at first base. Guy head sounded like a watermelon getting crushed. 100 pounds weight dropped on someone's face. Razor blade attack cutting someone's face wide open. Tons of blood. Child molester beaten so bad his eyelids were hanging off his face. Heroin overdose rigor mortis body. Saw a correctional officer get savagely beaten with a shaving cream cannon sock. Brutal. A padlock and sock beating of a cell thief. Inmate lit on fire while he was asleep. Never forget the screaming. Another child molester was got served by over a dozen inmates with fesses and urine cocktails. He was covered in so much shit it looked like a pig in mud. The whole cell block was vomiting and dry heaving from the stench. Saw another correctional officer get a protein bottle full of old piss thrown right in his face. It got in his mouth. Started puking instantly. I could go on. You get the point. I work at a women's prison, and although I have seen some things, it will never compare to an incident described to me by a former care of. A woman who was severely mentally ill decided to remove both her eyeballs in one of our MHS pods. The officer said they entered and just saw her eyeballs hanging from their sockets. Blood everywhere. I didn't even see it and I still get the heebie-jeebies. I was involved in a multiple convicted murderer receiving a call that his father had died. He was stoic as he talked to his mother. After leaving the sergeant's office, I escorted him back to his cell. He stopped in the hallway and asked, "Boss, is it okay to cry?" I said, "Of course." We paused for about 5 minutes and he let it out. Went back into his cell after. After everything I saw, it still reminds me they are human. NSFW. My brother was a medtech at one of the CA prisons. This was a few years back, but still brutal. He had gotten a call out on a guy who had been raped by several members of the BGF, Black Gorilla family. Apparently the kid was a white guy who had been convicted of raping several black children. They decided they were gonna teach the guy a lesson. So, they caught him coming out of the showers and about 6 of their largest members took turns raping him. When they were done, they stomped a 2-liter soda bottle up his ass. Brother told me they had to take him in for emergency reconstructive surgery. He lived but ended up with a double colostomy bag. I was just an inmate, but when I was locked up in the Bronx, I remember people making shids out of the toothbrushes we were given. Also, one guy screamed bloody murder to prove that the COs didn't give a fuck about what went on in the holding cells. No one checked on us. Also, the COs would purposely throw rival gang members into the same cell. I'll never forget some of their screams as they got hauled off into enemy territory. Edit. Also saw people get beat by the COs and pepper sprayed in the face while incapacitated. Then left in handcuffs for hours so they couldn't wash the spray off. Their screams were pretty bad too. One dude had a seizure and it took about an hour for a medical response. AMA. I don't really get to talk about this experience in real life. If anyone else is interested in stories like this, there are YouTube channels by former inmates talking about their experience inside. Unfortunately, stuff like this seemed to be pretty common. I knew shit was bad in prison but never realized how bad it was. This wasn't even prison. It was all for people awaiting trial who were legally innocent. How easy is it to stay out of trouble when there is so much going on around you? It's all about positive human interaction. You have to work with the people locked up with you. Share the bread, the water, the blankets, etc. There was no running water in the cells and no blankets until day 3. Until then everyone was dehydrated and freezing from having to sleep on concrete that sucked the heat out of you. Former state federal, female, corrections officer here. I saw a key fight among 2 male inmates in the common area of the housing unit. At the time I worked for the state, and at this particular medium security prison, The inmates are given an individual key to their cells. All of the cells are still behind a big steel door that only the corrections officers had keys to. So they were still confined within the housing unit. Anyway, something happened between the two inmates, and they did this thing where they placed the key in between their knuckles. So when they punch each other, the key acts as a brass knuckle. There was a lot of bloodshed in that common area. It was a whole mess and I had a lot of paperwork to complete because of it. There was a guy that covered himself in piss and shit then went on to fight a movement team. I have a friend who's a prison guard. Just the other day he was telling me about an inmate who called over one of the guards and held out his hand holding something in his fist. Not really thinking anything, the guard holds his hand out and the inmate drops what he was holding into the guard's hand. As he starts walking away, the guard looks in his hand and sees the inmate's testicles. I didn't ask if they were still in the sack, but I'll find out next time I see my mate. Then a few weeks later the same inmate cut off his penis. Taking No Nut November to a new level. Edit. Thank you for the gold and silver, kind Redditors. Rule number 1 of prison hospitals psych wards. If someone tries to give you something, say no or ask to see it first from a distance. Would that count as a gesture of affection or like some strange power move? Aussie correctional officer here. Most extreme would be seeing a mate and fellow officer narrowly miss get stabbed in the neck with a pen. Luckily it hit cheekbone and ricocheted up behind his left ear. Sliced that open though. He's a tough bloke who's been through much worse in the defense force overseas, and he was back at work the next day like nothing happened. Also saw an inmate beaten to within an inch of his life by 2 other inmates over a drug debt. Blood everywhere. Inmate didn't move until a few seconds before the response team got there. Felt like forever but was about 30 seconds. Looked dead. Funniest would be one of our more psychotic inmates in a suicide prevention cell. Toilet shower area were blocked off because he continually flooded his cell-less vision. He is known for producing the largest shits you've ever seen. Gotta be known for something, I guess. Without immediate access to his toilet, he decided to lay the ungodly log in the middle of his cell for all to see. Without exaggerating, this thing was 2 Coke cans together. Easy. He left it for about 10 minutes and then proceeded to use his ripped up shirt as a balaclava and gloves so he could pick it up. He then threw it with force at the ceiling, which is about 4 meters high. It stuck for a good 15 minutes. It took a lot of persuading to move him without use of force. He was handcuffed to the door to move him to a clean cell, and as the door opened the log fell and made a distinct thud of the floor. Everyone including the inmate had a good giggle at the whole situation. Was, for a short time, a CO at a LVL3 institution in the South. 23-year-old was refused a second peanut butter sandwich because he was no longer on a diet, but the doctor decided to get completely naked, cover himself head to toe in his own peanut butter, and stab one of my academy budders in the shoulder with a paper clip. We then had to gas him and execute a forced cell extraction. 5 guys in riot gear had to take this guy down, which he was naked and covered in shit. This was my second extraction. 2. Inmate was insulted by another and decided to retaliate by putting a cup of Vaseline in the microwave and then threw it in the guy's face, leaving him with serious 3rd-degree burns on his face and in his mouth. Dude got his eye socket caved in shortly after that. 3. We held most of the cutters in the state. These guys were very knowledgeable of the vascular system in the human body, would cut only what they needed to get high. Once in a while some guys would miss and hit a big artery. Watched a dude right after he hit in the main artery inside his elbow. Projectile blood must have been well over a foot in the air. Watched him slowly sag down a wall while passing out. We had to squeegee the congealed blood off the floor. Buckets of it. Not my favorite memory. 4. This was the worst. One of the cutters as mentioned above liked to open his abdomen. Big opening like 6 inches wide. One day we heard him complaining about a stomachache and told him to suck it up. He kept on about it, so we went to check it out. He had opened his stomach up and shoved trash and light bulb pieces inside of himself. I believe he had a crush on one of the nurses at the hospital and this was his ticket to see her. That's love. Reading these comments convinced me that prison is worse than I thought. Okay, so in my prison there is an area next to the nurses station where inmates suspected of being suicidal or having a meltdown are kept. Like a special observation area where med staff is close by. One Valentine's Day I was on that post and the nurse on duty was a pretty decent looking woman in her late 20s early 30s. We'll call her Jennifer. While I was doing the rounds she comes running out of the special observation area. I tried to ask her what was wrong but she just runs past me into the bathroom. It turns out an inmate had taken his poo and written Jennifer, be my Valentine with a big heart around it on the window of his cell. Nurse at a women's prison for a year or so. Inmate cut in line for her bunk's microwave and put her arm in. She got that microwave to the face about 30 seconds later. Had a psych inmate who chronically swallowed things. Forks, batteries, hair barrettes, razor blades. They were allowed to shave their legs. Well, after that incident she didn't get to any more. More faked seizures than I can even count. Which isn't extreme, I guess, but incredibly annoying. Most of the prison was bunk houses, similar to what you see in OITNB. But some of our older areas did have actual cells. Had an inmate not come out for like 2 weeks. Cells were open for Gen Pop. They were supposed to come and go to their jobs and group meetings and the like. After so long, we have to do an extraction. Where the guards suit up in gear. It was my first extraction. I was on hand because they may use fox spray. I laughed at first, because she was like an 80-pound Philippine woman, against 4 dudes and 2 women in near riot gear and fox spray. Then my jaw dropped because she took them on and nearly fucking won. My eyes still water thinking about it, because the fox spray definitely hit all of us to some extent. I've never flushed more eyeballs in my life. Had an inmate keep coming in with yeast infections to sick call. She kept denying sexual activity or anything that could be the cause. Finally got the truth of it. She had made a dildo out of Jolly Rancher candies. It took a lot of education to get her to understand that sugar in the vagina is a no-go. I used to visit jail once a week with my golden retriever, Cooper, who's a therapy dog. Any normal day I was asked for cigarettes or to smuggle something in my next visit, as I was never searched or walked through a medical detector upon entry. Don't worry, I never did. Anyways, my last visit there was around lunchtime. I entered a cell with 5-6 inmates who were Southside Los Angeles gang members. Inmates always made the craziest concoctions of sauces. Each gang had their own recipe of sauces, and my dog bolted for a glob of their sauce that was on the ground. After he ate it, the whole cell erupted saying Cooper is Southside. Cooper is Southside. That chant spread to the rest of the cells on that row and then to the rest of the 7 levels of cell rows. 150 inmates. The jail went into riot prevention and a lockdown ensued. Cooper was then listed as a gang-affiliated citizen and we were no longer allowed to visit. Not me, but me best friend, who works in a clinic for forensic psychiatry here in Germany, comparable to a prison for the criminally insane. A patient had attacked another guard out of the blue, the alarm went off. Said friend and other guards rushed in, removed the patient and got him into an isolation cell. Now here's the horrifying part. When they got back to help their injured colleague, They didn't recognize who it was at first and actually thought it was another patient because the attacker completely destroyed the guy's face. It was basically a bloody mess of flesh and bone. If you want to know more about America's prison system and what it's like inside, there's a great podcast produced out of San Quentin called Ear Hustle that's really good, and they're on their 3rd season. San Quentin is actually one of the better prisons out there, and it's still pretty horrible, especially for those on death row. My first job out of college was at a maximum secure juvenile facility. We had a male in a lockdown isolation cell. They were checked on every 10 minutes or less. In between checks, he pulled his big toenail completely off, then carved the names of his family members in his skin with the toenail. There was blood everywhere. He carved all over his chest, face, and legs. Almost 20 years ago, and it still haunts me. I'm not a prison guard, but a friend of a friend is. He told my friend when he's walking through the corridors, he can hear the people in for pedophilia watching children's TV shows, and the thing is they can't really tell them to stop either. He said it's very disturbing. Don't really know if you can class this as extreme, but it's something alright. We had one guy who was having extreme mental health issues, so policy is we put them in observation and someone has to watch them 24/7. Anyways, after we had gotten him into the observation cell, all they have is a mattress and a safety smock, prevent suicide webpage. He had razor hidden under his toenail was missed, and he pulled it out and proceeded to slice open his scrotum and pull out his testes and play with them. The officer watching him then called a medical emergency, and we then ended up taking him to the hospital to get everything fixed, and we then put him in therapeutic restraints and placed him into a medical induced coma to prevent him from hurting himself more. That's definitely crazy. How did he fit it under his toenail? Like, was it really long? Or inside the space? Also, are the stories of the honor amongst thieves true? Like prisoners hating child killers and pedophiles? A professor of mine worked in the commissary while he was going through university and loved to tell us about how in the movies it's all about drugs and cigarettes. But he made his money smuggling in off-brand ramen noodles, chips and dop. I'm sure other people were handling the drugs and cigarettes, but for the life of him he couldn't figure out why, if people were willing to pay ridiculous markups on items that won't get you sent to jail. As an aside, the scariest moment he would talk about was one prisoner fighting off 3 others by using a syringe filled with his own blood. This thread is like an endurance test to see how long you can read these stories if you made it this far. Good job. Alright, so I was looking for a job some years back. Any job. I ended up catching on as a teacher in a youth prison. Basically this place was populated by all boys, age 14-16 I think, something like that. My job was as computer lab administrator, where they took pre-get and other computerized tests. There were some other teachers there as well that taught other classes. I was a staff member of the school portion of the institution. Team. Yes, but still a prison. I had to be searched to enter the premises. Phone had to stay in the car, etc. So I went through the general prison guard training for 2 weeks at another prison. Self-defense training. The whole 9 yards. I went through that with newly hired guards for the state prison, etc. I start my stint at the youth facility and everything is going okay. We're outside the fence on lunch smoking cigarettes, and one of the actual guards tells me there are 2 or 3 new students coming that day, and asked me if I wanted to watch. Watch, I said. Watch what? He explains that when they first arrive they shave their head and strip them down naked and really embarrass them. This place was a military boot camp style facility. The more he describes this process I just get sick to my stomach. It was at this point that I recognized that while corrections may be a necessary part of our society, it is one that is certainly not for me. For a variety of reasons I ended up leaving the job a few days later. Not me but my dad, who was a warden for years. Dad opened up the prison that was developed by a for-profit incarceration company, and it was quite the shit show when my dad was brought on. Even the construction had problems. Things like you could see from the men's showers directly into the women's showers and vice versa. He had entirely new staff, new to corrections, fresh out of the academy, besides him and his second. Anyway, the week the facility opened, i.e. the week they got inmates, Dad's second comes into his office. "You've got to see this, Tom." "See what?" "I'm busy, Bob. You really have to come down and see this." Dad goes down to the block, and inmates aren't exactly rioting, but they are all out of their cells, refusing to follow orders, talking shit, getting worked up, and Dad's green staff is cowering in the control room. 300 inmates are pressing into the doors, getting loud and rowdy. My dad looks at the situation. His staff, his second, says stay on my 6, and wades in. All the instigators are at the front of this crowd, but Dad doesn't engage them at all. He elbows his way through, goes straight to the back where there are inmates who don't really give a shit but like to watch the ruckus. The leaders of the proto-riot are stuck on the other side of the crowd, and my dad starts shouting commands. "What are you doing out of your cell when we are on lockdown? Get back to your cell for roll call," etc etc. People at the back start to disperse, and that gains momentum until it's just the few instigators. And now you can deal with the handful left, plus they lost all their supporters. My dad is either really brave or really stupid, but prison stories are still my favorite. You said to work as a prison guard in Japan in '88. Some tall-ass foreign-looking kid just barges in and demands to stay in a cell even though he didn't commit a single crime. Odd. But I wasn't trying to get into a scuffle with that beast of a bod. Fast forward a day and I see this kid with a magazine, snacks and a beer can he just casually cracks open while his cellmates cower in fear. Odd. This was alongside his MILF of a mom just watching over right after getting shat on by her kid. This is where it gets interesting though. My gun just suddenly flies out of my pocket and into his hands where he proceeds to shoot himself and the fucking bullet stops in its place mid-air. At that point I just wanted him out, but thankfully his British looking grandpa and some Arab man in a robe came to escort him out. Most bizarre day of my life. I've got lots but I will start with just one. My facility had several cell configurations. This happened in a 24-man tank. There was one inmate that repeatedly stole from the other inmates and was caught red-handed. He was about to get his ass beat when one inmate stepped in to defend him. He reasoned that since all the stolen items had been recovered that the thief should be cut some slack. The rest of the tank went along with it but decided that if he was caught again that the inmate who defended him would have to take care of it himself. Inevitably he stole again within a week. The inmate used a broomstick to break both of his hands and beat him across the face so hard that he broke his nose, both cheekbones, his jaw, the orbits of his eyes, and ruptured one of his eyeballs. When he was done he called control for us to come get the pile that was left. The guy looked like a male orangutan in the face, with the big flat cheek pads. His eyes were swollen shut. His tongue was so swollen that he couldn't fit it in his mouth. The medics had to give him a trach so he could breathe. Once got told a story from a buddy of mine that's a prison guard. This one dude had a colostomy bag. I guess those things have an open hole that requires some sort of frequent medical maintenance. This dude's hole kept getting infected and being torn and the doctors were puzzled, and had to keep him loaded up with medication to fight it off. This dude's hole kept getting infected and torn because he was getting cigarettes from his cellmate in return for letting him fuck the hole. That's the part in the story where I started to gag. I worked in a prison in Iraq. We were training Iraqis to take the prisons over. We had about 8 separate buildings known as K-spans. We had turned one over to the Iraqis just to see how they could handle it. They didn't do well. When we got the call, we were just about to get off a 12-hour shift. We were in the middle of a shift change, so both shifts were present. Apparently the detainees thought this would be a confusing time for the guard force, but instead it meant we had double the amount of manpower. Back to the call. The Iraqis had lost the whole building. Their detainees had started to riot, and one cell, which contains about 20 men, was able to break a hole in the cell and escape. Luckily, there are 2 more layers of razor wire fence they have to get through before freedom. We get a call saying they need help at the K-span. We grab tasers, riot shields and flexi cuffs and start running. Of the 2 layers of razor wire to freedom, we are now inside the same layer as about 100 escaped detainees. From outside the fences, other guard force see us rushing into the riot and are all screaming "fuck 'em up." It was a very charged situation. The run was about 500 yards. As I approach the K-span, I see the Iraqi correctional officers, ICOs, in the rec yard. They have makeshift weapons trying to defend themselves from escaped detainees to X4s and other debris from the building being destroyed. They were fucked. Detainees hated the ICOs, probably more so than Americans. They saw them as traitors, which if I were in a detainee's shoes, I would too. And now it was 100 versus 10. We can only see the rec yard, not access it. We had to run around to the entrance and go through the building to get to it. Basically there was a riot of 100 men between us and the ICOs. We had to get the riot under control before we could help them. I was about the 10th US Guard force to show up. We immediately ran inside the building. It was chaos. Inside the K-span there are 20 cells, 5 on the left side, 5 on the right side on 2 floors, 20 men per cell. Most cells they weren't able to escape and were still inside. But one cell escaped and must have gotten keys as they opened about 4 more cells. All the cells on the lower right side were open. Roughly 100 men. A single hallway ran the perimeter of the cells, so we sent a team of riot shields in each direction to corral the detainees back to their cells. One team went right, the other left. I went left behind my buddy who had a shield. I had a taser. As we walked the hall, there are detainees in cells next to us and above us. They have igloo coolers they use for tea and are filling them with whatever body fluid they can produce and raining it down on us. The noise, the smell, the thunder of hundreds of men pounding on the cages next to us. Pieces of building and debris are crunching under our footsteps as we make our way around the left side. We are now at the back door of the building, which is the entrance to the rec yard. It was empty. The detainees must have realized there was no escape from the rec yard and came back in after beating the shit out of the ICOs. I didn't see them either. We shut and locked the door and continued around the perimeter hallway. We now made it around to the right side. Here we found all the detainees charging and getting ready to fight the other line of shielded guard force. The cells had a layer of plexiglass spit shields that have now been shattered into swords, which the detainees are now wielding. The 2 teams of shields began to come together, forcing the detainees toward the center. Most of the detainees gave up and simply went right back into their cells. About 20 were persistent and came charging for the shields, where they were easily detained. We finally pushed the last of the fighters back through the hole in the cell they busted out. These prisons were built cheap. The cells didn't have bars. They had a single layer of expanded metal grating as bars. They were able to beat a hole in it using an old man's crutches. It was about 3 feet in diameter. We got the detainees back in the cell, but now we had to go through and cuff them. My buddy and I were the first to crawl through the hole. He put his shield in first and followed behind it. There were about 10-15 men in there. Most had already given up and laid down, but 5 or so wanted to fight. I crawled through immediately behind my friend and immediately deployed the taser. Homie hit the ground. Funny thing about a taser is I can still tase you with the gun portion after I fired the leads. Only those leads still shock every time I pull the trigger. So the poor bastard I got with the leads had to get shocked again every time I had to use the gun to tase one of his buddies. It didn't take long for more guard force to get in behind us, so the detainees gave up quick. We cuffed them and began moving them out. Then went to clean the cocktail of body fluids off of ourselves. This was all at the end of my 12-hour shift. What a day. The ICOs who originally lost the prison were okay. The detainees beat the fuck out of them but spared them. They didn't come back to work as far as I know. Not me, but my stepdad's mom. We'll call her Meg. Works as a prison guard, and her husband, my stepdad's stepdad, we'll call him Steve, does construction and home renovation. Steve got a job to renovate a home after the previous tenant suddenly left and the place was found trashed. Carpet was ripped up, holes in the walls, garbage everywhere, the whole 9 yards. Now it was winter at this point and the house hadn't been heated for a while, so everything was cold. He's clearing out the junk and grabs a big bundle of rug all wrapped up. But it's too heavy for him to get by himself, so the guy he's working with comes up and they lug it across the room and throw it out the window. When it lands down below, it unrolls a little. Just enough that a hand starts showing. Steve didn't even notice until a little bit later when they're moving all the trash into a big garbage can. One of those industrial metal one. And he sees the guy's hand. He had been killed. Never heard how. And the guy wrapped the body up in the carpet he tore up and fled. Due to the cold, the body had frozen solid inside the carpet and apparently kinda shattered, being thrown out the window. Fast forward a year or two and they finally found the guy who did it. He goes back to jail where Meg works. It's a small town where most people know everyone else. So the guy knows it was Meg's husband who got him caught and hates her. Fast forward a few more months and he ends up being stabbed to death with a fork. Something like 200 plus stabs, which is a solid 4-5 minutes of stabbing straight. Apparently his torso was basically a mush. All of this because he had somehow snuck drugs into the jail and wouldn't share after his cellmate saw it. Meg said she didn't feel too bad about it. Either that or Meg maybe called in a favor from some prisoners to get rid of him because she feared he might come after her or give her out for allowing things to pass by. Oh wait, this is narrating prompts loloops. Walked out and locked my cage. Turned around to a guy right behind me covered in blood. Looked up to see his whole head just soaked in it. Called for an officer assist. Guy said he fell. Went to the spot he feel to no blood, no nothing. Day room with 50 other inmates. No one saw a thing. 3 officers came up. 2 escorted him. Other one stayed with me. Found out later he snitches on someone, so they cut his eyelids out. 2 weeks later I joined the military. Not a prison guard, but my good friend is. This happened a week ago. 2 prisoners were shouting and eventually got into a fight, which led to a full-out riot. Where things got extreme was they ripped a TV out of the wall to get to the electrical cables and frayed them. Then got bags of toilet papers and used the cables and toilet paper to create fireballs during the riot. Small fires were all over the place, as well as the classic shanks and bludgeoning weapons. Furthermore, all the prisoners used their pillowcases with eyes cut out so they couldn't be identified and proven guilty for anything they did, which led to them really removing any inhibitions. They basically had a room full of the KKK going full riot, murdering each other and flinging fireballs. When the fire department arrived, they tried using the hose to get cellmates back into their cells, which somehow wasn't working. SWAT and Pepperpool officers were also brought in. I was watching from outside. It was quite spectacular. Edit. To clarify, because some people don't believe me. Heck, I don't even know if I believe it. Firefighters are first responders, so they come automatically. They did not come specifically for the fireballs. Pepper guns are non-lethal and apparently just hurt a lot shooting balls of pepper. I was outside. I did not witness things personally. I just saw all the cruisers and vans and commotion. I asked a friend about it. I was across the street at a building that had an adjacent parking lot, not giving more details than that. They basically had a room full of the KKK going full riot, murdering each other and flinging fireballs. When the D&D session gets out of hand and all the warlocks duke it out. Adobe, check Sean Atwood on YouTube. And X200B. Ecstasy Kingpin, who runs a prison blog, really cool bloke. My sister worked for 1 week only at the state prison as a nurse and quit. Why? There was this 20 years old Latino kid who got in trouble with the wrong sort. So for a weed charge he was caught with a bigger amount he had planned for a party. He got thrown in with the major offenders for possession with intent to distribute. War on drugs, right? So he goes and joins a Latin gang like you do when you go to jail. They decided to use him as a fleshlight. He was raped so much that he decided to jump off the top bunk and land on his knee. By the time he was in hospital, he had lost a good 50% of bowel control. America has normalized shittiness and taught its citizens that it is okay. Poor baby. Rape in prison is a human rights violation and everyone treats it as hilarious, just desserts. Mine is from a closed asylum. I was pretty young, about 19, and checked in for my first shift ever. I went to the door and rang the bell. There was an electric lock which opened remotely, but the door was also held with some sort of cautionary chain higher up, so it only opened about 4-5 inches. Anyway, I press the bell, the door swings open and is caught by the chain. Into the crack pops the head of a goblin, just in front of my face, with a screeching wide open urge of a laugh from a toothless mouth. In his forehead there are several vertical slashes of deep cut wounds agape, gushing blood on my sneakers. The craziest welcome I've ever got. Stayed in the job sometime before starting my studies. The guy welcoming me was the serial self-mutilator in residence who had just banged his head open on the sharp corner of the outer door frame. Usually there was a door to cover the frame, but it was left open for me. About the guy. He was friendly to other people but really was hellbent on hurting himself. I ended up picking him up once when he jumped through a window. Another time I went after another patient for a second and the guy immediately bolted to the nearest pine tree, caught some cones and ate them before I could catch him. His teeth had already been removed because he tore his wrists open with them. For anyone thinking in humane practices, this was decades ago and people were really just protecting the guy from himself. Working in the towers. My first week in we had a lockdown situation. Rival gang member managed to get hostage with a shiv. He managed to wedge the door shut and we all watched as he slowly decapitated his enemy. Pretty fucked up, still remembering the look on his face as blood poured out of his jugular. Shit was fucked. Edit. He was charged with first-degree murder. Was switched out to isolated confinement. He had been planning this. I was not in charge of investigating, so all I really remember about the door jam was a well-timed pillow on the automatic door shutting. This seems like a hard thing to pull off with a prison shiv. One-on-one. How did he do this? Probably not the most extreme. That would be the fight where I thought a guy was dead, but I have a few. worked a segregation unit for crazy violent inmates. One of the guys made shit paper mash with his own feces and newspaper to form like turd Play-Doh. He covered his door and food hatch with it. Yum. Another time it was popular to make shit bombs but filling a horse drops Ziploc bag with feces and urine. Let it ferment for a couple weeks. Then when someone you don't like walks by, slide the bat under the door and stomp hard with your foot. Boom. A reeking 20-foot streak of excrement on the floor and your victim. I have more but these two come to mind first. CO for almost a decade. Worked segregation and psychiatric units for most of it. In the segregation unit, some guys are supposed to be allowed to wreck together and some are supposed to be kept separate. For their or other safety, 2 inmates that had been heard threatening each other were accidentally let out together. In the 90 seconds from the time their cell doors opened to the time we stopped the fight, one of the inmates had knocked the other down, kicked his head and stomach, and then kicked his scrotum so hard that the testicles tore their way out of the skin and became true external genitalia. In the psych unit it is not uncommon for inmates to pay others, inmate janitors, one-on-one psych watchers, etc., to get a piece of razor blade. When I say a piece, I mean something like 1/8 or 1/10 of the blade. They do this in order to self-harm, whether it's to actually accomplish the act or just get more attention. On one particular occasion an inmate procured one of these small pieces and managed to use it to cut through his abdominal wall in about 10 minutes. We were made aware of the problem by him banging on his cell door while he stood in the door window chewing on his own intestines. Those are probably 2 of the worst, but I have a lot more. I think the funniest story I can't usually tell in other company is when we found out how long it takes to bake a potato inside a man. I was doing the rounds in my unit, supervising inmates that were utilizing the exercise area, indoor. As I rounded the corner to the basketball courts, I heard some commotion. Now, the most notorious factions in my prison were the blacks and the Muslim gangs. I head toward the commotion, straight down the hallway, turn to my right, through the mesh, I catch a group of about 12 or so black inmates carrying a young, brown-haired male toward some gym equipment with a sock in his mouth. Some of the black inmates are masturbating, and I quickly realize what is about to happen. I call a code and I begin to corral these individuals into position and my mates join me in de-escalating the situation. When asked why, the ringleader of this motley outfit said that the young man they were about to take had been sold to them by the Muslims for 2 packs of cigarettes and some cottons. The problem, he said, was that he didn't want to be taken, so they had to take it from him. Makes me ill just thinking about it. My dad worked at the jail in Boston and has a ton of stories. I'm just learning about them now since I'm old enough to hear them. Once when I was 7 my dad came home covered in human feces BC of a fight that broke out. Neo-Nazis and the like were dad's least favorite group. He said there were gangs and stuff going on but he remembers you would get a white guy that had "Killen" written on his boots and my dad would love to put him on the floor with the majority of the black PPL. My dad said one guy said they would own them or whatever and one jail guard that worked with my dad said to him they're gonna distract us and get you. And then a few hours later that guy was begging to come out. Also my dad used to bring home rubber pens BC you can sharpen real pens into a weapon. My sister and I used to like the rubber ones. Picture the ink tube inside of a regular pen surrounded by rubber. No story there, just a fun fact. Not in USA. I knew a guy who did some time for weed possession on a tough prison. He told me about this kid around 18-20 who would get harassed and beaten by one particular fellow all the time. One day the kid mom goes to visit and the abuser gets a look off her and apparently finds her attractive. So he actually threatens the kid and demands to have sex with her. Word is that the woman had to do it several times. My friend told me that pretty much everyone agreed that the only solution for this kid problems would be for him to kill that guy, even if it meant a longer sentence. Not sure what happened in the end. Forget about war stories for a bit. Other than a tube of toothpaste up the old prison wallet for the reasoning of, it makes my teeth extra white. The best would be when the power went out, generator failed and there were visits were going on and it turned into half off at the bunny ranch. Stripping before heading back to cell blocks was unfortunately very memorable. I worked as a prison guard in Florida, where I saw a female inmate with a star-shaped birthmark on her neck masturbating. Had to transport an inmate to hospital for evaluation. He's a violent offender and difficult to manage at the best of times. So naturally I'm assigned to support guards who are pushing retirement, don't want to carry a sidearm and are totally unhelpful. The guy's fucking with the nurses, scaring the shit out of the doctors and being a total pain in my ass. He's saying foul things. I mean, foul enough that I wouldn't generally repeat them, and is tormenting staff trying to help him. The two other guards aren't going to confront him because they don't want to write an incident report. I get them to get coffee and handle it myself. Seconds after the other two dipshits leave, this young nurse comes in and introduces herself. He says he wants to do something disgusting and she says that he'll be released soon, and he smiles and bites his tongue in two. Smiles again and tries to say how about now as his tongue is flapping out of his mouth. Blood pouring down and bits of tongue falling onto his chest. I had to excuse staff and physically threaten him. I wasn't afraid of him and told him I was done and was going to beat him to death if he tried something else. I was so mad and talking to him with such pique that he didn't try anything else. I was mere moments from ending his useless life. He was a dangerous offender pulling a life sentence for multiple violent crimes and simply had no remorse for anything. He truly loved hurting people. Was escorting inmates to the second deck from the first. Now we were only supposed to escort 6 at a time as I was the only guard doing the escorting. But we were all in a hurry to get the inmates back in their cells and be on with our day. So I proceed to pack the inmates into the elevator, similar to what those Japanese guys do to the people at the subway stations. I mean, it was packed. I stepped in and called control to send us up. It was a busy day, so it took a bit for the control officer to get it going. I had my head down looking at the inmate list when I looked up just in time to see a fist flying at me. I had no time to react. It was danger close. I had a front row seat, less than a foot away, to witness that said fist plunge a broken pencil into another inmate's eyeball. All I had was OC spray, the kind that comes out like shaving cream. I sprayed the bad guy as well as some other poor guys that happened to be too close. The attack was unprovoked. In fact, the two inmates didn't even know each other. The suspect just didn't like the way the other guy looked at him. I had never had a single issue with the suspect at all. It was shocking, but it certainly changed how I approached my job. Complacency is very dangerous in an environment like that. It sounds like your lack of regard for safety and security protocols cost another human their eye. I hope he got some kind of justice. I wasn't a guard, but I was in prison during the 1950s and 60s. The most extreme thing that happened there was when a group we called the Sisters took a liking to a prisoner named Andy Dufresne. I wish I could tell you that Andy fought the good fight, and the Sisters let him be. I wish I could tell you that, but prison is no fairy tale world. He never said who did it, but we all knew. Things went on like that for a while. Prison life consists of routine, and then more routine. Every so often, and he would show up with fresh bruises, The sisters kept at him. Sometimes he was able to fight them off, sometimes not. And that's how it went for Andy. That was his routine. I do believe those first 2 years were the worst for him. And I also believe that if things had gone on that way, this place would have got the best of him. Of course I read this in Morgan's slow drawl. So relaxing. Even if the content is horrible. Just a small for your information. Prison guard is kind of a term that corrections officers don't like. It's like calling a paramedic an ambulance driver or a firefighter a hose dragger. Worked as a medic at a fire station that covered the local prison and jails for about 13 years. Saw more than a few murders and assaults there. But the first stabbing at the prison sticks in my mind. We got there and they were doing CPR on an inmate who was covered in blood, and when the nurse ventilated him, bubbles blew out of his head. Normally we wouldn't work that, but the prison wanted all deaths pronounced at the hospital, so we got started. While we were working, I kept hearing people say he got the 5-speed, or they gave him the 5-speed, and I didn't know what that was. After the call I asked a CO and he said they stick the shank into the skull and work it like a gear shift. He explained it with the hand motion and all and finished up with they call it the 5-speed, but it's shifting into reveries that really does it, and he laughed and I went on my way a little bit wiser and far more committed to never going to prison. Not my story but my dad's. He was working as prison guard a while back, and every morning, noon and night, they'd give them food, like any normal prison. So there was this one prisoner who apparently wasn't having it this day, and decided to piss all over the floor. So my dad decided he'd just slide the food through all the piss on the floor. So he has soggy pissy food until morning. Edit. Not saying it was the right thing to do, but it makes for a good story. I'm not a prison guard, nor do I intend to answer the question. I'm just here to point out how ludicrous and inhumane it is that it is thought of as reasonable and just that part of the punishment you will receive for breaking the law is to be brutalized by other criminals. As a former CO, once you're out of the jail system, which is problematic no matter where you are, the prison system isn't like that. Inmates are given a security classification and then sent to the appropriate prison for their designation. Support you get busted for meth. Unless you were arrested with a gun and trying to fight police, you're not getting a violent status and will be sent to either a medium or minimum security institution, depending on how likely they think you are to try and escape. And X200B. The problem is, at maximum security facilities, you have people who are completely and totally devoid of fear, inhibition and willingness to play by the rules. To be forced into maximum security and stay there requires you to be the kind of person that simply doesn't take initiative to play by the rules, engage with the support services available and work your way down to lower security classification. The fact is, even if you're a murderer with a life sentence, it's possibly to serve your last years in a minimum security institution or some sort of community establishment. But the people who don't are animals. And X200B. I saw stabbings. I saw beatings. I saw swarmings. I saw someone bite someone. The television movie trope of a non-violent offender trying to survive max security prison just doesn't happen. People like that aren't thrown in there willy-nilly. Guards are there to watch the world burn. But those who've worked in a high security institution know just how difficult it is, and often because the population we're dealing with only know violence and often there simply isn't anything anyone can do. We used to get offenders from the secure psych hospitals. Often they were just too violent and too dangerous for even secure psych hospitals and would be returned to prison. That's how violent they could be.